We're here at the east wing of the Albuquerque Convention Center to see the Albuquerque History and Culture Timeline, which is just inside on the second level at the top of the escalator. Hi, my name is Tom Miles, and I am the author and creator of the timeline. The timeline itself measures 4 feet by 16 feet and narrates 600 years of Albuquerque's history from 1400 to 2005. It was installed in April of 2006 in celebration of the 300th birthday of the founding and naming of Albuquerque. In December of 2009, a sister copy was installed in the passenger waiting area at the Albuquerque International Airport. This introduction to the timeline focuses on the 5 major structural components that make up the timeline. While the opening shot was done on location at the Albuquerque Convention Center, these shots are being done at home using this 2-foot by 8-foot copy that you see here. This is the size that the Tricentennial Committee gifted to all middle and high schools throughout Albuquerque for teaching history and social studies. There are 5 interrelated structural components or perspectives for viewing the timeline. There's a geographical view, there is an ethnic and cultural view, there are 2 time scales. The top time scale I call a story time scale, and the bottom one is a true time scale. The 5th one is a demographic or population line showing the growth in population over the 600-year period represented by the timeline. Now we take a closer look at the geographic and the cultural and ethnic portions of the timeline. From geography, we stand in Albuquerque and look outwards to Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico, to the United States, to Nueva España or Mexico, to Europe, and to Asia Pacific. The bottom portion describes the ethnic and cultural perspective, the arrival and contributions of the many and varied ethnic and cultural groups across this 600-year time period. The exception to this being the native population, which had been living here for more than 1,000 years before the arrival of Spanish Europeans. Next, we take a closer look at the upper time scale, which I call story time. In story time, segments represent periods that vary from 100 years to 10 years. This was done for 2 reasons. First is, as time progresses, more things are happening. And second is to keep the convention center copy from growing to more than 16 feet in length. We begin with the century of 1400, which is 130 years before the arrival of Spanish Europeans. In 1500 and 1600, we move to 50-year increments, and that covers the early Spanish period. In 1700, we move to 20-year increments, 1706 being the founding of Albuquerque, moving along through the Spanish colonial period. In 1800, we shift to decades, and in 1821, Mexico declares their independence from Spain, starting the Mexican Republic period. In 1848, the United States takes over the territory in the U.S. territorial period, which ends in 1912 with New Mexico being admitted to as a state in the United States. This continues in decades on until the year 2005, which is the end of the timeline. The bottom time scale is true scaled to 10-year intervals throughout. Of the 500-year Pueblo Indian era from about 1100, only 150 years are shown on this timeline. The 280-year Spanish era lasted from 1540 to 1821. While this scaling gives a better picture of the relative time various groups controlled Albuquerque, you really need to see the full timeline in person to appreciate the full impact. The nearly 30-year Mexican Republic period lasted from 1821 to 1848. The 64-year U.S. territorial period lasted from 1848 to 1912, when New Mexico was admitted as a state. So in 2012, New Mexico will celebrate 100 years of statehood. Next, we'll look at the demographic navigational feature to the timeline and how that depicts the 600-year demographic or population dynamic. There is a demographic legend in the lower right-hand corner with a color key for Hispanic, Asian, Black, Native American, and Anglo population segments. We've seen the geography, we've seen the ethnic and cultural groups, we've seen the 2 time scales. But it's not until we begin mixing those all together that it gets juicy and it becomes something that we call history. Let's begin with native Mexican tribal trade. This has been carried on for more than 1,000 years before the Spanish explorers had arrived. Plains Indian tribes had been raiding the Pueblo Indians for nearly 100 years before the early Spanish expeditions. In 1519, Cortés arrives in Mexico and begins the conquest and exploration of this new territory. 23 years later, in 1536, Cabeza de Vaca sends an expedition north into the area that will be called New Mexico. In 1539, 3 years later, the Franciscan monk Marcos de Niza and the black Moor Esteban send an expedition north into Nuevo Mexico. And in 1540, Coronado visits Albuquerque. It will be nearly half a century later, in 1598, when Juan de Oñate creates the first permanent settlement in what is known then as Nuevo Mexico. 72 years later, in 1680, the Pueblo Indians revolt and the Spanish flee to El Paso for 13 years. The timeline narrative explains the conditions and causes for this revolt. As the Spanish return in their reconquest of the area in 1692, many of the Pueblo Indians move away. 1706, the blue line, represents the naming and founding of Albuquerque. Shortly after that, the Pueblo Indians begin returning and actually forming alliances with Spanish to defend against the raiding northern, southern, and plains Indian tribes. It will be another 140 years until 1848 before Anglos from the east begin arriving after the 1846 Mexican-American War, the signing of the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Along with the 1854 Gadsden Purchase, the United States takes possession of all of the lands north of Mexico and west to the Pacific Ocean. 32 years later, in 1880, the railroad comes through Albuquerque, and it brings African American and imported Chinese laborers to work on the railroad. Another 30 years after that brings us to 1910 and 1920. Many Mexicans migrate to the United States to escape the Mexican Revolution. And then, in the 1930s, we see growth as defense business develops to support the World War II effort and the birthing of the atomic age. And in 1936, Route 66 comes through Albuquerque, bringing even more traffic and more growth. In the 1940s, the Bracero Plan with Mexico brings 300,000 Mexican laborers north to work in the United States during World War II. In the 1960s and beyond, rapid growth is seen from increased defense work, the birth of the personal computer, support of NASA's Man on the Moon program, and a generally improving climate for business. Most of this growth is coming from Hispanic and Anglo populations, with the Native American, Asian Pacific, and African American populations remaining rather constant. So, this has been the introduction to the 5 structural components of the Albuquerque cultural timeline. After this, I hope to begin working on a second video which will show and tell how the timeline came to be in the first place. After that, I may make some videos showing and telling some of the fascinating stories contained in the timeline based on viewership and comments. Stories like what was Pueblo Indian life like before, during, and after the arrival of the Spanish explorers? The recognition of the Pueblo's sovereignty by the King of Spain and by President Lincoln in the Spanish and Lincoln Canes of Authority. La Conquistadora, the story of North America's oldest Madonna, who became the patron saint of New Mexico. Juan de Oñate's Jornada North in 1598, and how 72 years later, unresolved conflicts and drought set up the 1680 Pueblo Indian Revolt. And a fascinating story of La Malinche, how a deposed native princess interpreter was key to Cortés in his conquest of Montezuma and Mexico. This brings this first video to a close. I hope you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it. And I hope this has helped increase the enchantment of this land of enchantment, whether you either live here or are just visiting. So until then, we'll see you next time.